Grace and peace. I'm Brian Musser, the Baptist campus minister at Drexel University, and this is Peace and Power Bible Study. The peace of Jesus Christ to change your life, the power of the Holy Spirit to change the world. And we are continuing our discussion on the book of Amos. We are in week 4, and we are in chapter 4. We are looking at what I've entitled a theophany, when God shows up this week. This session, our second video of week 4. The first video, we looked at some corruption going on, how social oppression led by the women through their husbands to the poor actually was affecting their worship. Even though they were worshiping right, God was not accepting it, and he saw it as more of a rebellion than of legitimate worship. This week, this video for this week, we're going to be looking at the judgments that God lays upon the people of Israel from their false worship and their oppression. So just want to kind of look at this. We're going to be looking at verses 6 all the way through 11, but we'll be comparing them to Deuteronomy chapter 28. And I would suggest, if you want to get a good context of the judgments that are going on in the book of Amos, you could read the entirety of Deuteronomy chapter 28. Now, it is a very long chapter, the longest chapter in Deuteronomy, and 1/3 of it is the blessings, and then the second 2/3 of it are the curses that deal with not obeying the law. Amos, and especially the judgments that come from Amos. Amos's entire tone is based on the fact that it is derived from the curses that would happen to Israel if they break the covenant with Yahweh. So we're seeing the fruition of what happens in Deuteronomy. But let's just look at some of these passages. Amos 4:6 says, I gave you absolutely nothing to eat in all your cities, a shortage of food in all your communities, yet you did not return to me. This is the Lord's declaration. In Deuteronomy 28:47-48, look at this, because you did not serve the Lord your God joyfully and gladly in the time of prosperity. Therefore, in hunger and thirst, in nakedness and dire poverty, you will serve the enemies of the Lord. The enemies the Lord sends against you. He will put an iron yoke on your neck until he has destroyed you. Interestingly enough, this Deuteronomy passage mentions prosperity, and Amos in the northern kingdom of Israel is talking to a very, very prosperous people, but he's prophesying that their prosperity will end up in hunger, with nothing to eat, shortage of food, which was probably the farthest from at least the leaders' minds of that culture at that time. They were prosperous enough that famine was probably not something that they expected to see in their lifetimes. The next one is a drought. Amos 4:7-8. I also withheld the rain from you while there was still 3 months until harvest. I sent rain on one city, but no rain on another. One field received rain, while a field with no rain withered. 2 or 3 cities staggered to another city to drink water, but were not satisfied. Yet you did not return to me. This is the Lord's declaration. I'm going to pick up Deuteronomy 28:22 in the next section, so we'll just leave it there for now. But this idea of drought and this idea of rain in different places, I was just on a Zoom call with campus ministers from Louisiana, which out of the last 35 days, they've had 2 or 3 days without rain. And then another campus minister from Oregon, who is in the middle of the driest season that they have ever had in his recent memory or any memory whatsoever, and are in the middle of fires because of that. But this idea of how important rain is, just especially in an agrarian society, but even in our culture, having rain at the appropriate time is just a huge blessing that none of us have control over on the individual scale. And we can talk about global warming on a large scale, but just on an individual scale, God blesses us with rain or doesn't. And this is a judgment by God to help us or Amos is saying, this is a judgment by God to help the Israelites return to the Lord. So, blight and mildew. Amos 4:9. I stuck you with blight and mildew. The locust devoured your many gardens and vineyards, your fig trees and olive trees, yet you did not return to me. This is the Lord's declaration. Deuteronomy 28, one that could have been used last time. The Lord will strike you with wasting disease, with fever and inflammation, with scorching heat and drought, the drought going back to the lack of rain. With blight and mildew, the same phrase as in Amos 4:9, will plague you until you perish. And look how 38 through 40 matches up with some of these other things. You will sow much seed in the field, but you will harvest little, because locusts will devour it. You will plant vineyards and cultivate them, but you will not drink the wine or gather the grapes, because worms will eat them. You will have olive trees throughout your country, but you will not use the oil, because the olives will drop off. So hopefully you're seeing that Amos is basically an application or a commentary on the curses found in Deuteronomy 28. It seems like that Amos knew, at least had some knowledge of the covenantal law found in Deuteronomy 28 especially, and the curses he is applying to the northern kingdom of Israel are just the curses that we can find in the book of Deuteronomy. Plagues. I mean, this one's a little bit straightforward here. I sent plagues like those of Egypt. Deuteronomy 28:59. The Lord will send fearful plagues on you and your descendants, harsh and prolonged disasters, and severe and lingering illnesses. War. Amos 4:10b. I killed your young men with the sword. Along with your captured horses, I caused the stench of camp to fill your nostrils. Yet you did not return to me. This is the Lord's declaration. The Lord will cause you to be defeated before your enemies, who will come out at them from one direction, but flee from them in seven. You will become a thing of horror to all the kingdoms of the earth. So war. And it's interesting, war is one of those judgments that God brings upon his people. But in order to do so, he has to move even pagan or less godly people to wage war upon his people. And this is another prophetic thing that often gets talked about. How could God use nations like Babylon and Assyria, who were corrupt in and of themselves, sinful and idolatrous, pagan, to judge the Israelites, who, even though they were sinful and rebelling against God, they were still they weren't any worse than the Assyrians. They probably were slightly better than the Assyrians, but why would God use sinful nations to judge his own nation and people? And it has to do with this responsibility that lies in the covenant. They had made a covenant with God to walk with him, and they had broken that covenant. And the consequences of that were these judgments. But they knew that. That was written in the covenantal terms from the very beginning. And the last one mentioned here is Amos 4:11. I overthrew some of you as I overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah, and you were like a burning stick snatched from the fire. Yet you did not return to me. This is the Lord's declaration. This is more exile, but the idea of just being destroyed. The Lord will bring a nation against you from far away, from the ends of the earth, like an eagle swooping down, a nation whose language you will not understand, a fierce-looking nation without respect for the old or pity for the young. Then the Lord will scatter you among all nations, from one end of the earth to the other. There you will worship other gods, gods of wood and stone, which neither you nor your ancestors have known. So the eventual total and complete overthrow of the northern tribe of Israel is both prophesied in Deuteronomy 28 as a result of breaking the covenantal promises that were just being implemented, and then is also prophesied in a much more recent in Amos 4, 6 through 11. So what is the relationship between Amos's prophecy and Deuteronomy? It's interesting. In Judaism, in Jewish religious thinking, the prophets, all of the prophets, are more or less commentaries or direct application of the Torah, especially Deuteronomy, into those current circumstances. So Amos, being familiarized with the Torah, or at least Deuteronomy, is saying to the northern kingdom of Israel, this is what God has said about what you're doing right now, your sinful rebellion against him. And this is how it compares, or how it's going to be applied to your absolute circumstances right now. And that creates a model. Amos maybe being the first written prophecy that we have recorded, written down, being written in 760. There are very few that would actually compete to being written down before that, is setting up a model for the other prophecies. Prophecy in the Old Testament is cultural and contextual application of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books, the covenant that Israel established with God. Now, in Amos 4, this suffering is described as a direct result of sin. But is this always the case? The Israelites sin, so they receive these judgments. But even in these judgments, we see war, we see famine, we see drought. And we have to ask the question, is everybody guilty of the sins that cause that? I mean, the people of Israel are guilty of the sin that caused God to allow them to be overthrown. But what if you were the one righteous guy among the many? And Scripture deals with this quite often. It deals with it in Job. It deals with it with Abraham and Sodom and Gomorrah. It deals with it in a multitude of ways. Sin leads to suffering, but it can lead to suffering of others as well. So some of us, we deal with suffering in 2 ways. We deal with sin in 2 ways. Sometimes we suffer sin upon us. So the sin of others, the fallen nature of the world affects us directly. And sometimes we are the sinners that cause the suffering. And there's a direct or indirect application. But there's this idea that all suffering in some way is the result of the bigger picture of sin. How humanity is no longer directly connected in a worshipful relationship with the God of the universe. So this is a complicated question. So you can't say you're suffering because of that specific sin. But you could say you're suffering because the world is sinful or sin-filled or just fallen. This language is something that can be used in that way. That's a much complicated thing to talk about, and if you want to discuss it further, either direct message me or drop a comment down below. I would love to discuss it further, and I feel like I glossed over it a little bit there. But there is this, that suffering is the result of the fallen nature of the way the world is not how it ought to be. Live Monday nights, you can always join us for this live conversation on Zoom. That information is below, and these weekly wrap-ups either on YouTube or on WordPress. I'm all over the social media: Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, WordPress, and YouTube. Those links are in the description below. Enjoyed having this conversation with you and hope it continues real soon.